The ship was beyond repair. Then the Admiral called in a veteran. Nobody dared to question the USS Franklin lay broken in the Pacific waters like a wounded giant. Smoke still rose from her twisted hull where Japanese kamikaze planes had torn through her flight deck 3 days earlier. Captain Michael Harrison stood on the bridge of the rescue vessel, staring at what remained of the aircraft carrier that had once been the pride of the Pacific Fleet. The Franklin was listing badly to starboard. Her flight deck, once smooth as a runway, now looked like crumpled paper. Holes the size of buildings gaped in her side, and seawater poured in faster than the pumps could handle. The smell of burning oil and metal filled the air for miles around. "Sir, the damage report." Lieutenant Commander James Walsh handed Harrison a thick folder. His face was grim, his uniform stained with soot from the rescue operations they had been conducting for the past 72 hours. Harrison opened the folder and read in silence. The numbers told a story no one wanted to hear. Over 800 men dead or missing. The ship's main engines completely destroyed. The hull cracked in 17 places. The electrical systems fried beyond recognition. Even the mighty steel frame that held the ship together was bent and twisted like a child's toy. "My God," Harrison whispered, closing the folder. "How many survivors did we pull out?" 233, sir. Most of them badly injured. The medical teams are working around the clock, but—" Walsh's voice trailed off. They both knew what he meant. More men would die before they reached port. The Franklin had been hit during what should have been a routine mission. The carrier was launching planes for strikes against Japanese positions when the enemy fighters came out of nowhere. The first kamikaze hit the flight deck where planes were being fueled and armed. The explosion was so massive that it lifted the entire front section of the ship into the air. But it was the second hit that sealed the Franklin's fate. A Zero loaded with explosives crashed directly into the ship's ammunition storage. The blast that followed could be heard 50 miles away. It ripped through 5 decks and sent pieces of the ship flying like confetti in a hurricane. Captain Robert Murray had been commanding the Franklin when the attack began. He was found 3 hours later, pinned under a collapsed beam in his ready room. His last words to the rescue team were about his ship. "Save her," he had whispered before losing consciousness. "Don't let her sink." But saving the Franklin seemed impossible. Every naval engineer who looked at the damage shook their head. The ship was simply too far gone. The smart thing to do would be to evacuate the remaining survivors and let the Pacific Ocean claim what was left of the once mighty vessel. News of the Franklin's condition reached Admiral Chester Nimitz at his headquarters in Hawaii within hours. Nimitz was the commander of all Pacific Fleet operations, a man who had seen more naval battles than anyone alive. He understood better than most what the loss of the Franklin would mean. Aircraft carriers were the backbone of the Pacific war effort. Each one took years to build and cost more money than most small countries had in their entire treasury. The Franklin represented not just a ship, but the hopes and dreams of thousands of American families whose sons served aboard her. But there was something else that bothered Nimitz about giving up on the Franklin. In his 40 years of naval service, he had learned that sometimes the impossible was just another word for difficult. And when things looked impossible, that was when you needed someone who specialized in making miracles happen. Nimitz walked to his office window and looked out at Pearl Harbor. The water was calm and blue, nothing like the chaos surrounding the Franklin 800 miles to the west. He thought about all the ships he had seen come and go over the decades. Some had died glorious deaths in battle. Others had simply grown old and been scrapped for metal. But the Franklin was different. She was young and strong, built with the finest steel and the most advanced technology America could produce. Under normal circumstances, she could have served for decades, protecting American interests across the world's oceans. The Admiral picked up his secure telephone and dialed a number he had memorized years ago, but never hoped to use. The phone rang 3 times before a gruff voice answered. "Yeah? Captain Murphy, this is Admiral Nimitz. I need you." There was a long pause on the other end of the line. When the voice came back, it was cautious, almost suspicious. "Admiral, with respect, I'm retired. Have been for 2 years now. I'm running a small repair shop in San Diego, fixing fishing boats and pleasure craft. The Navy and well, we didn't part on the best of terms." Nimitz had expected this response. Captain Sean Murphy was perhaps the most brilliant naval engineer who had ever lived, but he was also the most stubborn and difficult man the Admiral had ever known. Murphy had a reputation for getting results that bordered on the miraculous, but he also had a mouth that got him into trouble with superior officers on a regular basis. "I know about San Diego, Captain. I also know about the Franklin." Another pause. Murphy had obviously heard the news. Everyone in the naval community had heard about the carrier's near destruction. "From what I'm reading in the reports, Admiral, the Franklin is beyond saving. Any engineer worth his salt would tell you the same thing. Cut your losses and move on." "Any engineer except you," Nimitz replied. "Captain, I'm not asking you to perform a miracle. I'm asking you to do what you've always done. Look at a problem everyone else thinks is impossible and find a way to solve it." Murphy was quiet for a long time. Nimitz could almost hear the wheels turning in the man's head. Despite their differences, Murphy had never been able to resist a challenge, especially one that other people said couldn't be done. "What exactly are you proposing, Admiral?" "I'm proposing that you take a team to the Franklin and assess whether she can be saved. If you say no, we'll abandon her. If you say yes, I'll give you everything you need to bring her home. And if I say yes, and then fail, then at least we'll know we tried." Murphy chuckled, a sound that held no humor. "You know, Admiral, most people would think you're crazy for even considering this. The Franklin has been shot to pieces. Her engines are gone, her hull is compromised, and she's taking on water faster than Niagara Falls. But you're not most people, Captain." "No, I'm not." Murphy's voice was thoughtful now. "When would you need an answer?" "I need you on a plane to the Pacific in 6 hours. You can make your assessment when you see the ship." "6 hours? Admiral, I haven't even agreed to look at this job yet." "But you will," Nimitz said confidently, "because you're Sean Murphy and you've never walked away from a ship in trouble." The line went quiet again. Nimitz waited, knowing that pushing Murphy now would only make the stubborn engineer dig in his heels. This had to be Murphy's decision, made in his own time and his own way. Finally, Murphy spoke. "I'll need my own team, people I've worked with before. And I want complete authority over the operation. No interference from other officers, no second-guessing from headquarters." "Agreed. And I want it understood that if I say the ship can't be saved, that's the end of it. No arguments, no pressure to change my mind." "Understood. All right, Admiral. I'll take a look at your broken carrier, but don't get your hopes up. Dead ships usually stay dead, no matter how much you want them to live." After Murphy hung up, Nimitz remained standing by his window. The sun was setting over Pearl Harbor, painting the water in shades of gold and red. In a few hours, Murphy would be on his way to what might be the greatest challenge of his career. The Admiral thought about the 800 families who would never see their sons again because of what happened to the Franklin. He thought about the hundreds of survivors who were fighting for their lives in hospital beds. Most of all, he thought about Captain Murray, lying unconscious in a hospital ship, still believing his ship could be saved. Maybe Murphy would take one look at the Franklin and declare her a total loss. Maybe the smartest thing really was to let the Pacific Ocean have her. But Admiral Nimitz had not become the commander of the Pacific Fleet by taking the safe path. Sometimes, when everything looked hopeless, you had to bet on the one person crazy enough to try the impossible. As night fell over Hawaii, Admiral Nimitz began making the phone calls that would assemble the team Murphy would need. Engineers, welders, divers, and specialists in every field of naval construction would soon be racing toward the Franklin. Whether they would be going to attempt a rescue or to oversee a burial remained to be seen. But one thing was certain. If anyone could bring the Franklin home, it would be Captain Sean Murphy, the man nobody dared to question when it came to saving ships that everyone else had given up for dead. The ship was beyond repair. Then the Admiral called in a veteran. Nobody dared to question Captain Sean. Murphy stepped onto the deck of the rescue vessel and immediately understood why everyone wanted to give up on the Franklin. The smell hit him first. A mixture of burned fuel, melted steel, and something else he preferred not to think about. Then came the sight that made even his experienced eyes widen in shock. The Franklin looked like she had been attacked by a giant with a sledgehammer. Her flight deck, once flat and smooth, now resembled a mountain range of twisted metal. Holes large enough to drive trucks through dotted her hull. The superstructure that had once housed the ship's command center was now a pile of rubble, barely held together by bent steel beams. "Jesus!" whispered Chief Petty Officer Tommy Sullivan, Murphy's longtime assistant who had followed him out of retirement for this job. "Skipper, I've seen some wrecks in my time, but this—" Murphy said nothing. He walked to the rail of the rescue ship and stared at the Franklin with the intensity of a doctor examining a patient who might not survive the night. His weathered hands gripped the railing as his mind automatically began cataloging the damage. The list was extensive and heartbreaking. The ship's island, which contained the bridge and flight control, had been sheared off at the base. The flight deck was split in 3 places, with sections hanging down into the water like broken fingers. Massive holes in the hull were allowing thousands of gallons of seawater to pour in every minute. "Captain Murphy?" A young lieutenant approached nervously. "I'm Lieutenant Anderson. I've been coordinating the damage assessment teams. Would you like to see our reports?" Murphy turned and looked at the young officer. Anderson couldn't have been more than 25, probably fresh out of the Naval Academy. His uniform was crisp and clean, his face eager and hopeful. Murphy almost felt sorry for him. "Son, I don't need reports to tell me what I can see with my own eyes, but I'll take them anyway. Never hurts to have the details." Anderson handed over a thick folder, similar to the one Captain Harrison had received days earlier. Murphy flipped through it quickly, his experienced eye catching the important numbers. Hull breach locations, structural damage assessments, engine room status reports. It all painted a picture of a ship that was more dead than alive. "Lieutenant, how many men do we have working on keeping her afloat right now?" "About 50, sir. They're manning the pumps and doing emergency repairs to slow the flooding. But we're fighting a losing battle. The water is coming in faster than we can pump it out." Murphy nodded. It was exactly what he had expected. The Franklin was like a patient bleeding out on an operating table. You could try to stop the bleeding, but unless you fix the underlying problem, death was inevitable. "I need to get aboard her," Murphy said, "and I need to bring my team." Anderson looked uncertain. "Sir, with respect, the Franklin is extremely unstable. We've had 3 men injured in the past 24 hours from falling debris. The ship could break apart at any moment." Murphy looked at the young lieutenant with eyes that had seen 40 years of naval service. "Son, if this ship was safe, they wouldn't have called me. Now, are you going to get me a boat, or do I need to swim over there?" 30 minutes later, Murphy and his team of 6 specialists were aboard the Franklin. What they found was even worse than what they had seen from a distance. The ship's interior was a maze of twisted metal, flooded compartments, and debris that made movement difficult and dangerous. Chief Sullivan led the way with a flashlight, stepping carefully over bent beams and around pools of oily water. Behind him came the rest of Murphy's hand-picked team: Jake Morrison, a welder who could fix anything made of metal; Dr. Elena Rodriguez, a metallurgist who understood steel better than most people understood their own families; Mike Chen, an electronics specialist who could make radios work underwater, Pete Jackson, a hull expert who had patched more holes than a Swiss cheese factory, and finally, Murphy himself. They had worked together before, during the war years when Murphy was still on active duty. They were the team the Navy called when everything else had failed, when conventional wisdom said a ship couldn't be saved, but someone important wanted to try anyway. "Skipper, look at this," Morrison called from what used to be the engine room. The massive diesel engines that had powered the Franklin across thousands of miles of ocean were now nothing more than chunks of twisted metal. "I've never seen damage like this. It's like someone set off a bomb inside a bomb factory." Murphy climbed down into the engine room and examined the destruction with a professional eye. The engines weren't just damaged, they were completely destroyed. Replacing them would mean cutting holes in the ship large enough to lift out tons of metal, and then somehow installing new engines while the ship was floating in the middle of the Pacific Ocean. "What do you think, Skipper?" Sullivan asked quietly. "Can she be saved?" It was the question everyone wanted answered, but Murphy wasn't ready to give it yet. Saving a ship like the Franklin wasn't just about fixing what was broken. It was about understanding whether the ship's basic structure was sound enough to support repairs. "We need to check the keel," Murphy said. "If the backbone of the ship is broken, nothing else matters." They spent the next 4 hours crawling through the Franklin's bowels, checking every critical system and structural element. The damage was extensive, but as Murphy examined each section, he began to see something that others had missed. The Franklin had been built tough. Her keel was bent but not broken. Her main structural supports were damaged but intact. The ship's basic framework was still sound. It was just buried under layers of destruction that made everything look hopeless. Dr. Rodriguez joined him in what used to be the ship's main power distribution center. Banks of electrical equipment that had once controlled everything from lighting to weapons systems were now melted into abstract sculptures of copper and steel. "Sean, I've run preliminary tests on the hull metal," she said, consulting her notes. "The steel itself hasn't been compromised. The molecular structure is still sound. We're dealing with impact damage and fire damage, but the basic material is as strong as the day it was forged." This was important information. If the steel itself had been weakened by the extreme heat of the explosions, the ship would never be safe to operate again. But if the metal was still good, then the damage was really just a matter of replacing destroyed components and rebuilding damaged sections. Chen emerged from a flooded compartment with water dripping from his clothes, but excitement in his eyes. "Captain, I found something interesting. The main electrical conduits are destroyed, but the backup systems are intact. They're buried under a lot of debris, but they're functional. With some work, we could restore basic power to the ship." Murphy felt the first stirring of hope he had experienced since boarding the Franklin. A ship without power was truly dead, but a ship with even minimal electrical systems could be kept alive long enough to make major repairs. Jackson appeared from the lower decks with news about the hull breaches. "Skipper, I've counted 17 major holes and probably 50 smaller ones. It sounds bad, but most of them are above the waterline. The ones below the waterline are big, but they're not in critical structural areas. We could patch them." The picture that was emerging was different from what the initial damage reports had suggested. Yes, the Franklin was badly hurt. Yes, she would need months of intensive work to become operational again. But the ship wasn't dead. She was just very badly wounded. Murphy called his team together in what used to be the ship's wardroom. They sat on overturned furniture and broken equipment while he shared his preliminary assessment. "Here's what I see," Murphy began. "The Franklin took a hell of a beating, but she was built to take a beating. Her basic structure is sound. Her keel is intact. The steel is good. What we're looking at isn't a dead ship. It's a ship that needs to be rebuilt from the inside out." Morrison leaned forward. "What are you saying, Skipper? That she can be saved?" "I'm saying she can be saved if we're willing to do something that's never been attempted before. We can't tow her to a shipyard. She'd break apart before we got her there. We can't repair her here with conventional methods. We don't have the facilities. But we might be able to rebuild her right here in the middle of the Pacific Ocean." The team exchanged glances. They had all worked on difficult projects before, but rebuilding an aircraft carrier in open water was beyond anything they had ever imagined. Dr. Rodriguez spoke first. "What would that involve, Sean?" "We'd essentially have to turn the Franklin into a floating shipyard, bring in equipment, materials, and personnel, build temporary structures to support the work, seal off sections of the ship to create dry working spaces. It would take months, maybe a year." "A year?" Sullivan whistled low. "Skipper, keeping a workforce supplied and safe for a year in the middle of the Pacific? That's a logistics nightmare." Murphy nodded. "It would be the biggest naval engineering project ever attempted. We'd need supply ships coming and going constantly, weather protection for the work crews, temporary living quarters, medical facilities. It would be like building a small city on the ocean." Chen asked the question that was on everyone's mind. "Is it even possible?" Murphy was quiet for a long moment, thinking through all the challenges they would face. The weather in this part of the Pacific could be brutal. Supply lines would be vulnerable to enemy attack. The work itself would be incredibly dangerous, with men working on a ship that could shift or break apart without warning. But Murphy had spent his entire career doing things that other people said were impossible. He had raised sunken submarines, repaired ships that were supposedly beyond hope, and built military installations in places where conventional wisdom said it couldn't be done. "It's possible," he said finally. "Difficult, expensive, and dangerous as hell, but possible. The question isn't whether we can do it. The question is whether the Navy is willing to commit the resources it would take." As if summoned by Murphy's words, Lieutenant Anderson appeared in the doorway of the wardroom. His clean uniform looked out of place among the debris and destruction. "Captain Murphy, Admiral Nimitz is on the radio for you. He wants your preliminary assessment." Murphy looked around at his team one more time. These men and women had followed him into impossible situations before. They trusted his judgment even when that judgment led them into danger and difficulty. "What do I tell him, Skipper?" Sullivan asked quietly. Murphy stood up and straightened his shoulders. He thought about all the families who had lost sons when the Franklin was attacked. He thought about the survivors who were still fighting for their lives in hospital beds. He thought about Captain Murray, unconscious, but still believing his ship could be saved. "Tell him the Franklin can come home," Murphy said, "but it's going to take everything the Navy has to make it happen." The ship was beyond repair. Then the Admiral called in a veteran nobody dared to question. Admiral Nimitz received Murphy's radio call with a mixture of relief and concern. Relief that the Franklin might be saved, concern about what it would cost in men, materials, and money. When Murphy finished explaining his plan, the Admiral was quiet for a long time. "Captain, what you're proposing has never been attempted before. You want to rebuild an aircraft carrier in the middle of the Pacific Ocean using floating workshops and supply ships. The logistics alone would require a fleet." Murphy's voice crackled through the radio. "Admiral, you asked me if the Franklin could be saved. I'm telling you she can. I'm not saying it will be easy or cheap. I'm saying it's possible." Nimitz walked to his window overlooking Pearl Harbor while he considered the proposal. Below him, dozens of ships moved in and out of the harbor, carrying men and supplies to the ongoing war effort. Diverting enough resources to save the Franklin would mean other operations would have to wait. "Captain, give me numbers. How many ships? How many men? How long?" "I'll need at least 20 supply vessels, including floating dry docks, crane ships, and material transports. 500 skilled workers minimum, and at least 8 months, assuming we don't run into major complications." 8 months, Nimitz repeated. "Captain, in 8 months, this war could be over." "Yes, sir, it could. But if we save the Franklin, we'll have one of our best carriers ready for whatever comes next." and will have proved that American naval engineering can accomplish the impossible. The Admiral understood what Murphy wasn't saying directly. Saving the Franklin would be more than just recovering a ship. It would be a demonstration to allies and enemies alike that America didn't abandon its assets or its people. In a war where morale mattered as much as firepower, such demonstrations had value beyond their immediate practical benefits. "I'll give you an answer in 24 hours, Nimitz said finally. "Keep the Franklin stable until then." The next day brought news that spread throughout the Pacific Fleet like wildfire. Admiral Nimitz had approved Operation Phoenix, the unprecedented effort to rebuild the Franklin at sea. Supply ships began converging on the carrier's position from bases across the Pacific. Captain Murphy found himself in command of what was essentially a floating city. The first ships to arrive brought pumping equipment powerful enough to keep the Franklin from sinking while major repairs were made. Then came the crane ships, massive vessels equipped with derricks capable of lifting entire sections of a ship's superstructure. The floating dry dock USS Dewey was perhaps the most important addition to Murphy's fleet. Designed to lift smaller vessels out of the water for repairs, the Dewey was modified to partially lift one end of the Franklin, allowing Murphy's teams to work on the worst hull damage in relatively dry conditions. Dr. Rodriguez established a metallurgy laboratory aboard one of the supply ships, where she could test every piece of steel that went into the Franklin's reconstruction. Her job was to ensure that the repaired ship would be as strong as the original. "Sean, we're not just patching holes," she explained to Murphy as they watched welders work on a massive section of the hull. "We're essentially rebuilding the Franklin's entire infrastructure. Every pipe, every wire, every structural beam has to be checked and often replaced." The work was dangerous and exhausting. Teams worked in 12-hour shifts around the clock, cutting away damaged sections and installing new ones. The sound of welding torches and cutting equipment echoed across the water 24 hours a day. Chief Sullivan coordinated the crews with the precision of a conductor leading an orchestra. Each team had a specific job: hull repair, electrical systems, mechanical systems, or structural reconstruction. The work had to be carefully sequenced because repairs in one area often affected what could be done in another. "Skipper, we've got a problem," Sullivan reported to Murphy during the third week of operations. "The new electrical conduits won't fit through the damaged structural supports. We need to either modify the wiring or rebuild the supports differently." These were the kinds of challenges Murphy had expected. When you were essentially redesigning a ship while rebuilding it, nothing ever went exactly according to plan. Solutions required creativity, compromise, and sometimes completely new approaches to old problems. Morrison's welding teams worked in conditions that would have terrified most people. They welded underwater, inside flooded compartments, and on sections of the ship that shifted constantly with the ocean swells. Every day brought the risk of injury from falling debris, electrical shock, or simple accidents caused by working in an environment that was never designed to be a construction site. "The hardest part," Morrison explained to a visiting reporter, "isn't the technical work. It's working on a ship that's trying to fall apart while you're fixing it. Everything moves, everything is wet, and you never know if the section you're standing on will be there tomorrow." But gradually, the Franklin began to look like a ship again. The gaping holes in her hull were sealed with new steel plates. Her flight deck was rebuilt section by section, with new supporting beams and a surface that was actually stronger than the original. The twisted wreckage of her superstructure was cut away and replaced with a new command center designed with lessons learned from the original attack. Chen's electrical teams performed what amounted to a complete rewiring of the ship. Every circuit, every connection, every piece of electrical equipment was either repaired or replaced. The Franklin's new electrical system was more modern and more reliable than what she had carried before the attack. "We're not just fixing the Franklin," Chen told his team during one of their weekly progress meetings. "We're making her better than she was." The most dramatic moment came in the 5th month of the operation, when Murphy decided to test whether the rebuilt hull could support the ship's weight. The Franklin had been partially supported by the floating dry dock for months, but eventually she would need to float on her own. The test was scheduled for dawn on a calm day. Every person involved in the operation gathered on the decks of the surrounding ships to watch. If the hull had been properly repaired, the Franklin would float normally. If there were hidden weaknesses or imperfect seals, she could flood and sink within minutes. Murphy stood on the deck of the control ship, his hand on the radio that would give the order to lower the Franklin back into the water. His team leaders were positioned at critical points around the carrier, ready to report any problems immediately. "All stations report ready," Sullivan announced over the radio. Murphy took a deep breath. "Lower away." The massive cables that connected the Franklin to the floating dry dock began to pay out slowly. Inch by inch, the carrier settled back into the Pacific Ocean. Every eye was focused on the waterline, watching for any sign that the ship was taking on water. For 10 minutes, that felt like hours. The Franklin settled deeper into the water as the dry dock released its support. Finally, she floated free, riding the ocean's swells like the ship she had been built to be. A cheer went up from every vessel in Murphy's improvised fleet. The Franklin was floating on her own power for the first time since the kamikaze attack, but floating was only the first test. The real challenge would be getting her engines running and her systems operational. The rebuilt engines were the most complex part of the entire reconstruction. Murphy's team had essentially built a new power plant inside the Franklin's hull, using components shipped from shipyards in California and Hawaii. Every pipe, every valve, every gauge had to be perfect, because engine failure in the middle of the Pacific Ocean would be catastrophic. The moment of truth came on a gray morning in the 8th month of Operation Phoenix. Murphy stood in the Franklin's rebuilt engine room, his hand on the starter switch for the main engines. Around him, his team monitored dozens of gauges and indicators. "All stations report ready for engine start," Chen announced over the intercom. Murphy looked around at the men and women who had worked for 8 months to reach this moment. They were tired, dirty, and pushed to their limits, but their faces showed confidence in what they had built. "Starting main engines," Murphy announced. The sound that followed was like music to everyone who heard it. The deep, powerful rumble of massive diesel engines coming to life echoed through the Franklin's hull. Gauges showed normal pressure, normal temperature, normal operation in every system. For the first time since the attack, the Franklin was truly alive again. The ship's maiden voyage under her own power was a short one, just a few miles through the Pacific swells to test her handling and stability. But for everyone who watched, it was a moment they would never forget. The Franklin, which everyone had written off as dead, was steaming through the water under her own power. Captain Robert Murray had recovered from his injuries just in time to witness the Franklin's resurrection. Still weak from months in the hospital, he stood on the bridge of one of the escort vessels and watched his former command prove that American determination could overcome any obstacle. "She's beautiful," Murray said quietly, tears streaming down his face. "She's even more beautiful than she was before." The Franklin's return to Pearl Harbor 3 weeks later drew crowds of thousands. Families of the men who had died in the kamikaze attack came to see that their sacrifice had not been in vain. Shipyard workers who had said the carrier could never be saved watched in amazement as she steamed into the harbor under her own power. Admiral Nimitz was waiting on the dock when the Franklin tied up to her berth. He had followed every day of Operation Phoenix, receiving regular reports on the progress and setbacks. But seeing the rebuilt ship with his own eyes still amazed him. Captain Murphy was among the last to leave the Franklin. He had spent 8 months bringing her back to life, and saying goodbye was harder than he had expected. As he walked down the gangplank for the final time, Admiral Nimitz was waiting for him. "Captain, what you and your team accomplished will be studied and remembered for generations. The Franklin is better than new, and the techniques you developed will help us save other ships in the future." Murphy looked back at the carrier one last time. Her flight deck gleamed in the Hawaiian sunshine. Her superstructure rose proudly against the blue sky. She looked every inch the fighting ship she had been designed to be. Admiral, when people said the Franklin was beyond repair, they were thinking conventionally. Sometimes you have to stop thinking about what's impossible and start thinking about what's necessary. The Franklin needed to be saved, so we found a way to save her. The Franklin would go on to serve with distinction for the remainder of the war and for decades afterward. But her greatest victory was not against any enemy. It was against the idea that some things are beyond repair. Captain Murphy and his team had proved that with enough determination, skill, and courage, even the most hopeless situation could be turned around. Years later, when naval officers studied the Franklin's resurrection, they would learn more than just technical procedures. They would learn that sometimes the difference between success and failure is simply having someone who refuses to accept that failure is inevitable. The ship that was beyond repair had come home, brought back to life by a veteran nobody dared to question.